All right. We up and running? Okay. Welcome everybody to Public Accountability Meeting. If we could just quickly go around the table and do some introductions, that would be helpful. Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, Tom Thorpe, I'm the PCC's Policy and Scrutiny Manager.
And Tom, just to be clear, you've got to leave at 3, so please feel free to do so.
Jane Palmer, I'm the Chief Constable's Chief Finance Officer.
Dave Jones, Chief Constable.
Amanda Oliver, Assistant Chief Constable.
Claire Craven-Griffiths, Chief of Staff.
Will Naylor, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner.
Steve Thomas, Detective Superintendent, Head of Crime Operations.
Good afternoon, Fraser Sampson, Interim Chief Executive Officer to the PCC.
And welcome, Steve. Is this the first time you've been here? Second time you've been here, yes. So we've got apologies from Deputy Chief Constable Lisa Winwood, Assistant Chief Constable Phil Kane, Jane Wintermeyer, Maria Earls and Rob Bowles. So if we can go on to the minutes, and if I just take them for accuracy, just as a point of interest really, as these meetings are recorded and people can review them, we haven't put anything other than actions in the minutes and would refer people back to the recording if they want to listen to the substantive discussions.
I do think we should update it to provide that link there and make it as easy as possible for people. So we've said it's available to watch, but we don't make it easy for people to go and watch. So we should make that, improve that for next time. Okay, thank you very much. So is there anything on the minutes that anybody wants to raise? Nope. Okay, great. Okay. Then they are approved. So, have we had any questions from the public?
No, not from the advance.
No. Okay, great. Thank you. So, Steve, over to you.
Go on the microphone. I knew I was going to make that mistake. Detective Superintendent Steve Thomas, Head of Crime Operations, been asked to just come and present a more in-depth look around the thematic of burglary. So, I've got a number of different buttons.
Steve, can I just add a little bit of context as to why we've picked burglary? Is that for this meeting? Would that be all right? I should have done that absolutely. A minute ago. So during the consultation for the police and crime plan, burglary came out as the #1 concern for members of the public, and also it is in the police and crime plan itself. It does crop up as a priority in the local plans for local areas. So I think it's important that we set it in that context, that this is something that the public has a visible impact on the public and is something that they have expressed as a clear priority.
Okay. So, first slide just helps people with a bit of an overview about what burglary actually is. It is, the more deeper you delve into it, quite a complicated piece of legislation. But in simple terms, Section 9(1) of the Theft Act 1968, you're guilty of burglary if you enter any part of a building as a trespasser with intent to steal, inflict grievous bodily harm or commit criminal damage, or having entered that building or part of a building as a trespasser, you steal, you attempt to steal, or inflict or attempt to inflict grievous bodily harm. So it's fairly complicated if you break that down, but unless anyone particularly wants me to, I'll move on. Because the landscape in terms of understanding performance and outcomes around burglary changed quite significantly from the 1st of April this year. Prior to that, you had 2 classifications: burglary dwelling, which I think is fairly straightforward. It's residences, and burglary other, which would be sheds, outbuildings and commercial buildings. But from the 1st of April, that changed to burglary residential and burglary business and community. And it just depends on the use of the building as to whether it falls into the residential category or into the business and community. And that's basically around the impact that it can have on a victim if the garage in particular is within the curtilage of your dwelling, or if it's a shed that's in the curtilage of your dwelling, that should be counted as a residential and not differentiated. So the quality service that you receive as a victim is the same as if it was part of your house, because it impacts on your home and your family life.
Okay, so what would a farm be? Is that a business or is that a residential? Or you see what I mean?
Yeah. If it's the farm,
for example,
if it's the farm building which is for your home, then that would be a residential dwelling. So it'd be classed as a residential, and we would also be able to subcategorise it as a dwelling so that we could compare that over time. If it was the buildings within the farm that are used mainly for carrying out the business of the farm, that would be business community.
Was the basis of the recategorisation to give them equal footing? So sheds are given, it sounds like they get sort of equal service, not that they necessarily didn't before, but was that part of the reason to sort of, just because it's not, someone didn't come in your house and came in your garage instead, but actually it's as impactful on you as go through the front door?
Yeah, the reason it changed was because of a politician who had their garage broken into at the same point that a neighbour had had their house broken into, and because their neighbour's garage had a door into the house, they felt they got a separate service, a different service, because it was classed as a dwelling because of the integral nature of the garage, whereas because the other victim's garage wasn't integral to the house, they got a different service, and it was deemed that it has a similar impact on the victim, so the legislation was changed, hence the recording practices have changed.
Thank you.
What we have been able to do is, without creating too much back office work, we are able to compare dwellings within that as a subset moving forward. What we can't do is back categorise all of those previous burglaries and work out whether or not they are residential going backwards. So it does cause one or two challenges.
And I do think that in a place like North Yorkshire, it does cause complications, doesn't it? Because that distinction between business and residential is not always clear.
Yeah. And sorry.
I think the way we tackle that, well, Commissioner, is our strategy around rural crime focuses particularly in that, so that whilst the counting rules may have changed to make sure service is equitable, our approach to rural crime and the approach that we use within the Force Control Room is about making sure that we're engaging with our vulnerable communities, including our rural areas that are more isolated. So whether it be a farm building or a dwelling, we would assess it in relation to the need of that person rather than how it's categorised from a Home Office perspective.
Yeah.
On the back categorisation point, did we have an understanding of how many businesses were burgled historically, or will that be a new feature of this?
It'll be a new feature. We can look at burglary other and try and work out, but you have to do keyword searches to be able to count, and it's not entirely accurate. One of the reassurances I can give you is that since the 1st of April, we've undertaken a comprehensive dip sample to make sure that we've got the new categorisation right, and it's bang on. So, and we've got another one planned for the end of October. So then, once we move through the year, we'll have at least a quarterly dip sample to make sure that we've got it right. And the other thing is obviously both ourselves and the new control room for the scenes of crime attendants at all of these offences conduct a Thrive assessment. So it should be really about the needs of the victim rather than just a bland categorisation of the offence.
But I do think it is helpful having a business category. I think that is quite helpful. It's business and community is rather odd because, you know, if it's a, I don't know, village hall or something, that's not a business. Well, it could be a business, but is it community? I don't know. There's all sorts of things, examples you could pick, aren't there? But
and I think some of the community issues we're trying to work out whether or not if you've got a community allotment and you've got sheds within the community allotment, whether or not is that a community building or is that the private shed of the person who has the allotment. So it does get quite complicated.
And then you've got houseboats, caravans.
And whether the caravans are occupied at the time or for the most part of the year.
All right, we could spend a long time on this. This is only the first slide of your presentation, Steve, so let's move on.
Sorry, just to help, I think just for the public's benefit is that regardless of the classification, the analysis that we do is also keyword analysis, as Steve mentioned. So if the word farm is mentioned, if the word shed is mentioned, or that is part of the analysis around how we then seek to tackle that particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next slide. This just sets where we are in context with the national picture and over time. One of the things that I would say is a caveat to this, that in order to use statistics, we have to use close statistics for the end of year, so it takes us up to compare 16-17 with 15-16. Because this year is a part year to look at trends over time, we're not unable to do that. But what this basically picks out is the fact that comparing the two performance years up to the close of play 16-17, 29 forces recorded increases in burglary dwelling, and that the average, excluding the Metropolitan Force area, was that there was an increase of 8.2%. And that for North Yorkshire, we're in the top 5 lowest crime rates for burglary per 1,000 households, and that we actually saw a decrease between the two performance years of 7.4%.
Inevitably, one has to ask Steve, why?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, but I think the two biggest impacts, I think, have been the sentencing changes, that burglary has become less desirable because of the impact of sentences. Plus, I also think that a lot of the burglary dwellings over the past 3 to 4 years have been driven by the need to steal car keys, and that vehicle security has changed significantly over that period of time, and we've seen a reduction in those types of offences as well.
Okay, so can I just, do you want to follow up?
Well,
sorry, go on.
Only because that makes sense on a sort of national scale potentially, but North Yorkshire seems to be in a very good way. So burglary is coming down, it looks like, which is great, but other forces see it go up. What are we doing that's so good? I suppose we should be talking about that.
I think there's certain things that are unique to a county like North Yorkshire compared to a large metropolitan area, which is that connectivity with the community, and people are spotting things in their own communities which are out of kilter. So we get quite a lot of reports of vehicles or people in particular areas that people haven't seen before. You don't get that in large urban areas. People don't have that kind of connectivity with and also the relationship with the community is probably better.
So intelligence, effectively, just the public are telling us what looks odd, and then we can deal with those before it becomes a burglary.
The other thing that you'll see in the Performance Pack Commissioner is some examples of cross-border criminality, which is predominantly linked to what we call a two-in-one burglary, where a house is broken into for the car keys. We use ANPR technology really effectively there, and there are some examples within the pack of when we've done exactly that. Okay,
so to play devil's advocate a little bit, which you would expect me to do. We obviously did a survey back in a couple of years ago now, looking at crime in rural areas and underreporting. I wonder also whether that has been factored in, because we've got a predominantly more rural area than other forces, and in comparison to other forces we might have seen a greater impact in that. So and if we've got fewer officers out and about in rural areas, whether that is a consequence of it as well.
Burglary dwelling is probably one of the most statistically significant crimes. People will report burglary dwellings, and it's probably one of the crime categories that I'm probably more reassured is probably being reported effectively for insurance purposes. I think when you get into what used to be burglary other than
that's
dwelling,
that's what I'm
that's different, but the burglary dwelling one is the one that most people rely on, because most people will ring the police and tell us if they've had their house broken into. If it's a shed or a farm building, often that's not the case.
Yeah.
So to test some of those working hypotheses, then, who are the other four forces in the top 5?
I haven't got those details here, but I can find them for you.
Probably, excluding different powers, which is Wales.
Microphone.
Sorry. It's the usual suspects. It's probably Gloucestershire, Dyfed Powys,
Devon and Cornwall.
Devon and Cornwall.
maybe Dorset.
And Dorset, probably. But we can look at it. But there's been a national downward trend in burglary since about, well, it's going to be going down for the last 25 years. And some of that is better forensic techniques. The sentences has a real impact. Why would you do burglaries if you can do something else and make the same amount of money? The risk has gone up. It's a bit like why we don't have bank robberies anymore. It's just, there's a real deterrent there. Greater security in relation to the target hardening of premises. There's a standard now around doors and windows, which perhaps haven't been there in the past.
Like nicking car stereos is nigh impossible nowadays. I have to say, I went on Op Checkpoint a couple of weeks ago, and the rural watchers who are doing sort of overnight intelligence things and trying to look out for people was great. There was, probably 20 or so members of the community active all night, till the really early hours of the morning doing all this, and the partnership was great. So that certainly plays into the bit the Chief mentioned earlier about the sort of public participation in that.
I do think that is a big element of it, because everybody knows what everybody's doing, and I do think that is a big element of it.
I think the other thing is that certainly for the 2-in-1 burglaries where you're breaking in order to steal the car, then the geography actually helps us in one regard, because we're a big county, therefore you have to travel over our roads, which is why the ANPR is so important.
Okay, and the second part of the slide just does the similar comparison then for in old money, burglary other, so sheds, garages, outbuildings, etc. And again, estimated 19 forces recorded increases between the two performance years, and that average was, excluding the Met, at a just less than 1% reduction overall, but we feature in the top 10 of the lowest crime rates per thousand population, and that we've actually seen a decrease between those two close performance years of 16%. It's quite a positive picture.
So what we are planning to do, just so you're aware, is we're going to repeat the NRCN survey to see, because obviously we've got a sort of benchmark of where we were a couple of years ago to where we've gone now, and I think that'll be quite interesting to see the results of that, and that'll be in the next sort of 4 to 6 months.
If I can suggest what it might be helpful to do as part of that, just within North Yorkshire, is to see whether we can look at the calls that are coming into the force control room, where they came from, whether we've seen, because of the strategy that we've had in place, any increase in reporting from rural areas. I don't know whether that would be possible, but it might be useful to look and see if we can, just to see whether we've seen any increase in that area.
I think we need to agree what we mean by a rural area, but yes.
we do have a definition of a rural area upon which that survey was originally based, so we would want to compare apples with apples, so yeah.
I think the important thing for me will be what was the level of confidence in reporting in North Yorkshire when we first did the survey. We then implemented, didn't we, the Rural Task Force, which was all about not only prevention but engagement. And we've done a real push around visiting as many farms and small holdings as we possibly can, trying to encourage people to report. So it'd be really, really useful having a look at what the survey tells us now, because that for me will be a measure of success of the team, so I'd really welcome that.
Okay, the next slide, again, uses the old classifications, and we'll move on to show how that differs slightly when you apply the new classifications. But it just shows the up-to-date picture up to August 17, how you can see that reduction in burglary dwelling compared to a slight fluctuation, I will call it, in burglary other, and that's why you see a plateau overall when you look at overall burglary dwelling, which is to the left-hand part of the slide. What you find in terms of burglary other is that in Q1 there was a significant decrease, which then shows a slight increase then for the following part, but overall it shows a long-term downward trend in burglary overall, and that non-dwelling burglary is in line with the longer-term trend. It's just that 1 quarter is unusually low.
You're going to get the why question again. So do you know why? Well, it wasn't floods or anything like that. You know what I mean? Was there anything?
We've looked at any obvious factors, which would be environmental, etc., and there's nothing that jumps out at all.
Sometimes, Commissioner, with figures as low as ours are in North Yorkshire, you can have 1 or 2 teams active here in North Yorkshire that you haven't had in previous years that would just tip us up or down slightly. I mean, the burglary dwelling figures there, and you think about the size of North Yorkshire and the City of York, and we are saying now that we're averaging less than 2 houses a day being burgled. I think that's really, really good news and should reassure people. That's a huge achievement.
And we do look and do some of the scoping across with surrounding forces, because it may well be that if you've got a travelling criminal or a group of criminals and they've been sentenced and are out of the equation for a period of time for something that we're not automatically aware of, it can actually have a significant impact, because obviously there could be a mini crime wave that disappears, but there's nothing that's jumped out.
So it's not. I don't think we get onto it later, Steve, but. You might not know the top of your head, but how much of this is re-offending? So if you're being proactive with burglary and looking people up, that then might have a quiet period because the people who are burgling North Yorkshire by and large are now in prison or on remand or whatever, and then they come back and it goes up. Do you know what I mean? Is it quite a lot of re-offending in burglary?
There has historically, less so now that the sentences are ramped up based on re-offending rates, so it makes it much less attractive. 3 strikes and 5 years in prison is quite an impactful sentence for burglary nominals. Again, re-offending figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because if you don't catch someone for it, you don't find out that they've re-offended, so it's not always ideal, but there will be an element of it.
There's also, I think, with the because of the way that the probation service is structured now, it's quite difficult for us to actually understand what some of those re-offending figures are for North Yorkshire specifically, and I think that's a challenge for us on the local criminal justice board as to how we work with partners to get those figures. That is a concern.
So as promised, if I can get my slide to move on. There we go. And then we've got the local picture, and this uses the new classifications. So again, you see that on the left-hand side, you've got a plateaued but overall long-term reduction in burglary. And then on the right-hand side, you've got burglary residential. And what you see there is that the previous slide's 509 burglary dwellings are now included in an overall 909 count for residential, because that captures some of what were others, and your business and community at 567 under the new determination.
So given that the reason for this change in classification was to make sure that burglary other and burglary dwelling were treated in the same way, does that have an impact on resourcing? Because you're in effect got a lot more crimes that you see what I mean?
Potentially.
I think if we were a force that responded to crime types, depending on, looking at a crime type and saying, will we send an officer or not, then it would definitely impact on resourcing, but we've not gone down that route. What we've said is we will use that risk assessment called Thrive. So we look at the threat, harm, risk, investigation opportunities, whether somebody's vulnerable and whether we can engage.
I understand that, Amanda, but I just think that potentially, and when we come onto some of the other statistics further on, I think there are some interesting things that we would want to explore, but I understand that that's how you deal with it, but from a practical point of view on the ground, if people are being said, we've got to spend as much attention to a shed as we do to a house, does that have an impact on the ground?
I think if we gave a poor service to the victims of burglary other, that probably would be the case, but I don't think it is, and we certainly haven't noticed a significant increase in demand. But I think when we saw the legislation when it came through, our conversation was, are we suddenly going to be having to do work that we currently aren't doing? But that hasn't borne out in reality. And I think Thrive does allow us to assess each crime on its own merits, regardless of its classification.
I think actually the bigger risk for me when I looked at the changes was around public confidence. So what you're starting to do is to report differently to how you've done before, so the public may feel when they look at the statistics that the number of burglaries of houses has suddenly gone up. actually with the context of what we're now capturing, that's really, really important to get across. That I was really, really worried about the fear of crime and public confidence. So I think it's important we get that message out.
Nationally, there was no statistical requirement to differentiate dwellings, but we've kept on doing that because I think for that very point we need to be able to say which of this new recording classification are actually houses, homes where people are living.
Can I, just on the back of that, actually, because I think the reason why in the police and crime plan, for example, the burglary came out at the top of the public's concerns is less because they necessarily experience burglary, but because of the invasion of privacy that it entails, it is of a greater concern than potentially other crime types. In the fact that we're now recognising that quite a few of what was classified as other might have been sheds in back gardens and therefore still that feeling of an invasion of privacy, is that change in classification and the increase of an understanding that these are actual people's residences that are being invaded, is that changing prevention tactics or kind of reassurance tactics in any way? Are we reassuring the public about the decrease in burglary in any way differently to what we did before to kind of mitigate that fear of crime that you're talking about, Amanda?
I definitely think that one of the subtle changes around crime prevention, because the tactics that you would usually employ would be around windows, door locks, etc., around the setting of a home. And I think because there's an increased focus on any building within the curtilage of someone's home, that we're becoming smarter about the different types of security measures. So officers and staff should be going out and giving the same advice, whether it's your shed or your garage or your allotment or what have you. So that is probably one of those increases in demand. But again, we're learning as we go along with that. But I don't think it's a huge demand, if I'm honest, because again, going back to Thrive, if you've got an opportunity to investigate, it shouldn't really matter whether or not it was your house or your garage. We'd carry out that regardless.
The other important thing for me is, whilst it definitely is about invasion of privacy, it's also about risk. And actually, when we look at a burglary, we always look to see if the house has been occupied. Because the risk of that occupant disturbing a burglar and then confronting them and then what might pursue afterwards could end up in a homicide. So they're the real types of high-end burglaries that we really do worry about and concentrate on.
Just on the prevention angle, I carry the stat around, Chief, I think years ago when you threw this into one of these meetings or a similar one, that roughly a third of burglaries were because a door or window was open or it was insecure effectively. Do we know if that's changed at all? And I know there was an operation recently where cops in York were putting balloons through people's windows and things to sort of signify that they were open and accessible. Is that work continuing? Have we seen any sort of evidence of change?
We monitored that over the summer. I didn't put all of the stats in it because I think otherwise it might have become a little bit too heavy, which you might argue it is already. But we did start to see a decrease in terms of insecure properties. But I can get you those figures outside of the meeting if you want to see. But it has started to come down. I think, again, as a local resident and being part of the community messenger, you start to see those messages blip up on your phone, and it does make you aware. So I think some of that will be having an impact.
I think in the modern day crime prevention strategy, I think they still use around the 30% mark for open doors and windows for people to commit burglaries. And the modern day version of that is about a third of all cybercrime could be prevented if people had decent passwords.
Okay, moving on then. The next one does look using rural wards. There's a bit of a caveat at the bottom of the slide, but it compares burglary using the old classification and again shows to the right-hand side there a steady decrease over time in terms of burglary dwelling using the old classification, but a slight increase then in terms of burglary other. The long-term trend overall is still down, and the classification of rural versus urban is done at ward level only, and that obviously some of those wards deemed rural do have cross-cutting elements of urban area within them.
So my question there is then, how do we get a richer picture? Because that is quite a high-level sort of classification. And secondly then, within that, how do we understand what is going on in those areas that are particularly at risk from cross-border crime in rural areas. So trying to sort of get a richer picture around where what's going on in rural communities rather than just a ward level, which is quite a sort of high-level analysis.
Difficult, because I think it's almost like you'd have to have a separate classification of rural, which would be those areas almost by geographically coding them in terms of the areas that are distinctly outside of urban areas.
Well, you can do that through postcode analysis, obviously, so that is through this, that is perfectly possible to do that.
I think this is where we kind of, again, around like the NCRN sort of survey, getting some kind of agreed definition of the because there's super output areas, there's medium-sized output areas, and what granularity you want. Some of the issues, if you go down to the granular level, we don't have the volume to inform the analysis. A bit like Amanda was saying, that in some of these areas you're getting maybe one burglary every couple of weeks, which actually is in one sense reassuring, but on the other sense from our perspective difficult then to do the analytical work and who we're going to target, etc. So I think it's like anything else, we can go from postcode level all the way up to force level, national, regional, all that sort of stuff. But I think for this meeting, I think we need to be clear around what granularity we want.
So the survey used the ONS definition of rurality, so it was based on a standard national definition. So we will base it on that rather than, you know, that's not perfect, but what we don't want to do is change what we did before, because then we won't be able to compare it.
We're in danger of violently agreeing with each other. I think the issue is around the practicalities of applying that definition to our analytical tools and the way in which we record information. And I think it's a bit like anything else. Is if we can do that, that's great. If not, we might need to do a little bit of rejigging of our analytical work.
Well, we also know from the victims work that we did a while ago that postcode is not necessarily the way that is recorded on police systems isn't always helpful to this process. So just because it's not something that is material it's material in an analytical point of view, but not material from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the classic in Old Force of Mine, the Trafford Centre is one of the hotspots in Greater Manchester, but it's actually huge, and you can't subdivide it into the actual shops and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, and then the next slide is using the new classifications. And again, it shows the similar figures to the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side you can now see that under burglary residential, those previous 222 dwellings are in a group of 455, and I think that reflects what we were talking about earlier, about you will have buildings that previously would have fallen into the other, but that fall into the residential, because in rural communities you will find that they are part of the curtilage of the dwelling. And, you know, if it's not part of your business, if it is your shed or it is your garage, then quite rightly it should come under that classification, but that's why it shows an increase.
What about a tractor? If your tractor is parked in the same place as your car, does that count as a garage and therefore as a residential or as a business? Again, there is an element of subjectivity, but if the tractor is part of your business and therefore the building is primarily used to house your tractor, which is part of your business, then I would say that that is a commercial or business. Yeah. So then the next slide moves on to have a look at outcomes. So there are 21 outcomes, but splitting them into 4 overarching categories for ease and simplicity. You have resolved, which is in all money sanction detection, but includes community resolutions. Then you've got victim-based, which is largely because the victim refuses to engage with the investigation or the prosecution. Prosecution-based outcome, where the evidence threshold has not been met, or there's a police or CPS decision that it's not in the public interest to continue, or that the investigation hasn't identified a suspect. Just to outline where they are, we'll go into more detail in the following slides about a resolved sanction detection, because obviously you'd expect us to focus on that. In terms of victim-based, you're talking about 0.9% of all outcomes. To give you an idea of the scale, prosecution-based, where the evidential test isn't met or it's not in the public interest, is 5.7%, and where no suspect has been identified, that's the largest group, which is 87.7%.
the danger of me asking questions from an informed position. So if you were trying to explain to the public if there was a spate of burglaries on an estate and the police mount an operation and arrest the people they suspect of being responsible for 20 burglaries, how come then we only end up, say, charging them with 2 or 3?
Mainly down to the evidential test, whether or not it's met. It's not our decision, but sometimes if they don't admit it, you can only charge with those offences that there's direct evidence to prove against those individuals. And again, that would come down for burglary in particular, and certainly burglary dwellings, a decision made by the Crown Prosecution Service. Because
we get criticised for, you know, the detection rate for burglary being at a low level, but, you know, from a practical operational perspective, we often believe that we've got the right people, we just can't prove for more than maybe 1 or 2 offences. Yeah.
It's the biggest frustration of an investigator.
And does that fall into no suspect identified because they're not formally identified, i.e. you think you know who they are and there's pretty good circumstantial evidence, but if there's no direct evidence, that comes under no suspect identified?
If you've got reasonable grounds to suspect somebody of being involved in the offence, they'll go on the offence as a suspect, so you would have a suspect identified. So that would be if you've got enough grounds to arrest somebody, for example. But to prove is a significantly higher threshold to cross over. So yeah, where you've got a suspect identified on the crime, that would be captured in there. It's where there's nothing to suggest. Intelligence wouldn't be enough. So, like the Chief says, if we know that there's an individual who's burgled an estate, we'd need more than that, even if we could prove 2 of the burglaries were them directly. So we'll look at resolved outcomes in a little more detail in the next slide then. It is quite busy, but I'll try and explain it. The top graph shows a downward trend in overall resolved outcomes for burglary. And again, crimes recorded under the old classification will retain the classification purpose for outcome. But then it breaks it down into a little bit more detail underneath, and you can see that actually the overall downward trend is driven largely by a reduction in outcomes for burglary other, whereas you will find that certainly in the last performance, in this current performance year, we've started to see an improving trend in outcomes for burglary dwelling. And again, for the reasons we outlined before, we'll continue to monitor that as a subset of the new classifications. The national figures there just give, I think, some reassurance that burglary dwelling for the performance year 16-17, North Yorkshire were ranked 14th for our outcome rate, and we're currently above the national average in terms of sanctioned detection or resolved outcome rate. One of the positives here is that our performance is driven largely by Scarborough and Rydale, who have managed to sustain a significantly higher resolved outcome rate, and that's largely because they haven't suffered some of the abstractions and vacancies within the investigative teams that the others currently have that we're now working to resolve.
Okay, so because I've got this slide and the following slide, so I'll trait this sort of. I don't know. Well, I'll take it all in the round rather than go on to the next one, because it'll further analysis of the same trend, isn't it? So what you've got in effect is about a 40% reduction in burglary other from charge to summons between 2014 and 2017, which is quite a significant reduction. And actually, even though the burglary dwelling is not as significant a fall, it's still quite a significant fall statistically, from 17% to 13.6%. That's still quite a big difference. I just trying to get my head around the reason for this, and you've alluded there, perhaps because obviously there's been quite a lot of change in the force around the investigation hubs and all of that sort of stuff over this period of time, and whether or not that check, because it takes a while for change to bed in and teams to get, to mean, so you would expect to sort of see that changes, whether or not there are any issues that you've identified that have been addressed and will now deal with some of those issues.
There are a couple of recurring themes that I would call big ticket items, and you will see evidence of this as you move forward. Things have changed from this performance year compared to last performance year, and it's not just the Chiefs of Stew recruitment into the force. So. mention, because just throw it in there. But actually, there was some back office work that needs to be done around crime admin. That's now starting to land, and you start to see now that there were outcomes that were waiting to be resolved that hadn't actually hit the performance books, so to speak, and they're now starting to catch up, and they're catching up in a more timely fashion. So when we look at the speed of outcome, you'll also start to see that that is actually starting to improve as well. The other thing that I think is a big ticket item is those two areas of the force where they have seen significantly increasing demands in certain areas, which again I will show in the presentation, and that work has landed within the same environment where we've had vacancies, which I think has impacted on the focus around probably longer term investigations into some offences that may resolve in TICs, so offences that are taken into consideration, so you get the outcome, you get that detection, but not from your primary investigation. And again, you know, the availability of a resource to be able to dig deeper and deeper and deeper is only limited to the work that's coming in through the front door.
Okay, so one of the other concerns then would be that given those pressures that you've identified there, and I know that steps have been taken to deal with that, you've obviously seen also a reduction in the speed
to resolution.
Yeah. And again, whether or not that is I'm trying to understand whether there is we've had anecdotal feedback from police officers on the ground that they feel that and you allude to this further on in the presentation, that there are other more serious things that they need to be dealing with, and there's a balance between, you know, that sort of more serious stuff and some of these types of crimes that if it's not a house, somebody's home, might be deemed to be less serious. Whether there's a tension in the organisation around that.
I think the tension is something that will be resolved largely by filling the vacancies that we've currently got. And again, we've got work in place to deal with that. And as you know, it's a national issue for you know, investigation right across the country in most forces. If we can fill those gaps, I don't see that any of this will be.
Steve, is there anything that you've found from your research and the work that you've been doing that we're not investigating crimes with a positive line of inquiry?
No.
So it's more around our analytical, trying to identify people where there isn't a positive line of inquiry? Yeah.
And also, you know, to pursue a conspiracy, you would need an awful lot of analysis, pulling in intelligence, and then you would need to attach it to a primary investigation where you've got detection, and then have someone to admit all of those other offences. And again, when you see a 3% reduction in a drop of taken into consideration, it actually has an impact on your overall rate. But you could say that that's not really as a result of the quality of your initial investigation. But that's a huge investment of time and resource, where things are stretched at the moment because of those gaps and some of the increases in the other crime types that are probably slightly higher on that severity index. It does present a challenge.
There's also the philosophical thing that taken into consideration was often seen as a means by which you can bump your detection rate, but actually the outcome from a judicial point of view is marginal. So basically taken into consideration is the judge has sat there, you're already there for 2 burglaries, and you take 20 others into account, and in theory it's dealt with there and then. But it doesn't really, if you'd have just taken them for the 2 burglaries, they'll probably get the same sentence.
It's very, very difficult to explain to a victim that that's a positive outcome, because invariably it results in a reduction in sentence, because they seem to have been helpful. So I think the days of that being seen as a positive outcome have gone.
I think that the percentage of things that we're talking about though here is still so small, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the overall, because if you looked at this in any other statistical setting, you think, hang on, close to 90% of the stuff we're talking about it isn't, if you like, going anywhere. Yeah. It wasn't viable from the off, which is almost all of it, isn't it? And that's and that's the case in every force area I've ever looked at. So there's something about the nature of burglaries which puts you in that category, but it's a reality with all the neighbours as well, all the other police forces like that.
And it fluctuates depending on time of year, because obviously forensic evidence is fantastic, but you tend to get more of it in the summer months. In the winter months, you tend not to. And again, depending on what is the particular crime type, stealing electric equipment that can be traceable gives you more lines of inquiry. Stealing cars, again, gives you more line of inquiry. If it's gold, it's almost impossible to identify it, and therefore you would find that if you've got a crime spike in that particular area, you'd really struggle.
And part of this to remember is these numbers must be quite low. If we're talking about quite a few burglaries end up in a resolution, and it's going down, 3% or whatever it might be, I presume these numbers are quite low, given there's only a couple of burglaries a day or whatever the factors were.
Yeah.
Can I ask that question in a different way? If the number of burglaries are reducing, and we're also seeing the number of cases in which we can identify a suspect and create a resolution decreasing, are we in effect being left with the cleverer, the more intelligent criminals? Could that be a factor in this as well? Is there something that needs to be done in looking at the type of crime that's being committed?
I think if it all happened in a microcosm, I think you would probably find that the dedicated resource looking at the same thing with the same investigative opportunities, it would probably be comparable over time. I think the difficulty with this is that our performance has to be taken into context with all of the other increases, because it's the same workforce that's investigating it. And therefore, at the same point that we've got a reduction in these numbers, and we've got a slight change in terms of we're moving away from 2-in-1 burglaries where you can trace cars and other trackable assets, coupled with the fact that the investigators who maybe would have chased those secondary detections around TICs, etc., are heavily involved in long-term complex investigations around vulnerability and safeguarding.
Okay. So in effect, then there is an issue here, isn't there? Quite a fundamental issue, in that the workforce is stretched. There's more complicated, quote unquote, more serious crime going on, and they are working on that and not on this. Not on this, but not as much on this.
I think in simple terms, yes, there is a tension, and we have to prioritise around where the resource has to go.
So what are Scarborough and Rydale doing then?
Well, Scarborough and Rydale haven't had anywhere near the same difficulties with vacancies, so they haven't seen the abstraction.
Right, because of the hub.
They also have a consistent team, I think, that's been there a long time, etc.
And one of the things they were very, very successful in a spate of burglaries, which was, as the Chief alluded to, it was around almost full-time occupied caravans, and it was a spate. I
remember that.
And they were all detected really quickly. It was a really positive outcome, but it significantly supported their detection rate, which is great. But
hence why those spikes, because these are low numbers, if you can catch a serial burglar who's done 10 houses and that you can detect them all, that will probably make a percentage increase.
Yeah. So unless there's any other questions, I'll move on to the next slide, which just covers a little bit about, again, I touched on it, it's the speed to gain a resolution. And I think it's safe to say that the quicker you can reach an outcome, the more likelihood you have that it will be a positive one. And I think what this just goes to show is that having gone through a difficult period where those timelines had elongated slightly, that we're now into a position where we're starting to get back on track. We're resolving things quicker, and I think that's having an impact in terms of the outcome rate, particularly for burglary dwelling, where the primary focus should be. The only thing I will apologise for, where it says at the bottom, the last PowerPoint, the last paragraph on the PowerPoint suggested that it should be taken in conjunction with another slide. I took it off because it was too complicated. It didn't help at all. I just forgot to take the bullet point off, sorry. But I just wanted to show the fact that, yes, we have had an issue. That workforce has become, it's become a complex area. We have had vacancies, and I think that's impacted on the fact that some of these offences were taking longer to be resolved. but a lot of that is that back office function. So the officers in the case, if you look at one individual instance of burglary, would have resolved it, but it would have sat in a queue waiting for the back office admin function to resolve it and never actually get clarified. We've got to the bottom of that now. It's much more streamlined, so those resolutions are being accounted for and the positive outcomes being put onto the performance books at a much earlier point.
Okay, so Steve, it seems to me, and there's a number of issues here. So, and it's really helpful. So thank you very much, because it sort of squares the circle to a certain extent around some of the feedback that we were getting back from officers on the ground a few months ago around how they felt about all of this. So there's been an issue around, you know, vacancies, which is being resolved. There's an issue around competing demand around complexity and threat, risk and harm, and then there's an issue that has been in relation to change, and in particular the investigation hubs and how they've been working. Those things are now settling down, and what we're starting to see is an improvement in performance again. Yeah, okay, that's good.
And the one thing I would say about the investigation hubs is that, and again, I wasn't here for that, but my understanding is, and certainly my firm belief now, that they were always intended to flex both towards the lower, less complex level and severity of crime, which would be towards a response workload, through to the more serious crimes. And because that's where we've seen the increase, certainly over the last 24 months in particular, that's where their attention has been drawn. And I suppose in some senses, the bits that have taken a bit longer have been in the area around burglary through volume crime.
Yeah, okay, all right.
That is starting to improve now.
Well, that's good, because that gives me some reassurance, because we had identified some issues around all of this, and so that's helpful. Thank you.
It might not be your specific area, Steve. And it's a slightly different question, but how far off are we of having not fully staffed hubs, because that's probably a little while off, but how far are we down that road now, do we think?
We're currently doing a recruitment campaign that includes investigators specifically, and I'm hopeful that we will have addressed a chunk of the vacancies, and there'll still be more to do, particularly to try and attract investigators. And again, it is something that North Yorkshire is experiencing, but it's not in isolation, it's a national problem. But you know, I'm confident we've got some things in place that will help us in that regard.
Okay, so because obviously if I link this back to the police and crime plan, and this being a particular priority around those local priorities that people have expressed, I suppose my question was, you know, some people have said to us, oh, well, this was a while ago, you know, burglary is not in the police and crime plan, therefore it's not a priority anymore, therefore we're going to turn our sort of focus onto other things. It is in the police and crime plan now, or in those local contexts, and I suppose my question is as it's been so clearly a priority for the public, how will things change over time? And you've just articulated that, so that is helpful. Thank you.
Okay. The next slide, as I alluded to before, just talks about setting the scene really about the rise of other crime types over that period of time. The Office for National Statistics is developing a framework which weights crimes by severity. Burglary, in the general sense, ranks mid-level, with obviously dwellings slightly higher than non-dwellings. But high-severity crimes such as rape, serious sexual assault, homicide and robbery fit within that category. And North Yorkshire, as is the case nationally, have seen a rise in those high-severity crime types such as rape.
Do you know if the ONS are taking into account the sort of thrive element, i.e. a burglary in really rural location might be more severe than or might not be, but severe in burglary somewhere else? Or is it just literally on the crime type?
It's crime type.
Yeah, but having said that, though, we did demonstrate through our victim needs assessment that we did quite a while back that crime type was a driver of impact as well. So so we do know there's a correlation between the type of crime and the seriousness, quote unquote, of that crime and the impact that it has on the victims. So it's not always the case, but we do know there is a correlation around harm to victims. I mean, I suppose my concern here, and if you know, would be that, you know, it's a volume crime. It's something that people are concerned about in their local communities, and for them, the public needs to feel that the force is taking this issue seriously and can cope, notwithstanding the other the rise of the other crime types. This is real sort of solid business as usual for North Yorkshire Police.
On the confidence front, I wasn't here either, I don't think, before sort of scientific support was already embedded, but from what I can gather, it used to be, or sometimes was the case, attempted burglaries were attended by CSIs. And that's less often the case now. There's a sort of centralised, albeit very specialist and successful team. And as some of those sort of changes to some of the fringe elements that aren't necessarily the police direct response and an investigation, but some of those wider sort of evidence gathering type functions, has that changed some of the resolution rates or anything around the success of an investigation?
No, there is a slide at the end of the presentation that outlines the service that we're getting from the Regional Scientific Support Unit, which hopefully will reassure you that we're in a very, very strong position. The standard service level agreements should always be that the attempt should be taken as exactly the same as a full offence, particularly for a dwelling, and therefore it would then be down to if there is a realistic likelihood of being able to yield anything by the CSI attending. Sometimes that's obvious, sometimes it's not, and if there's any doubt, then the CSI should attend. And I think you'll see from the service we're getting at the moment, it's pretty much 100%.
So, but it's... Okay, well, we'll come on to that when we come on to it. Okay. Yeah.
So again, I don't propose to do a huge amount of detail. This just illustrates that in some of those complex areas there have been some significant increases over recent years. Obviously the first slide is violence with injury, which includes homicide. And thankfully that is just plateauing in recent years. Robbery, as you can see, has increased certainly over the last 4 years.
The numbers are tiny though on robbery,
they are small
aren't they?
Numbers,
yeah.
Yeah. But what I would say is that obviously that doesn't differentiate between a sophisticated robbery of a business premises involving a team of criminals from across the country compared to a one-on-one encounter on the street for a mobile phone. So that will include a certain degree of complexity. Stalking harassment has increased exponentially over recent years. And again, they are complex investigations to make sure that you're protecting the victim.
Can I ask, is that mainly because of the way it's reported or identified by the police now? Confidence
in reporting and the publicity that's been around that and high-profile cases, learning and education within the organisation and ensuring that we've got the right recording. And I expect that will continue to increase until we're in a position where we're confident that we've got an accurate picture.
Which is one of those crimes, like domestic abuse, you want to see increasing really because we're pretty sure it's happening.
It will plateau at a point, but I'm not sure we're there yet. Domestic violence with injury, again, over recent years you'll see an increase, but again, thankfully just starting to plateau, and again, that may well be that one of those in years to come we'll look back and say maybe that was the point where we'd got things to the point where the picture was accurate. Other sexual offences, significant increase, unsurprisingly, over recent years for similar reasons that we've just alluded to with stalking harassment. And rape in particular has seen a steady increase over recent years, and again a huge amount of complexity involved in investigating those offences.
The danger of these slides and the danger of the next slide is that it almost sort of sounds like because of all of this we're not taking burglary seriously, and I think we just need to be careful that that's not the message that we're giving across.
Absolutely
here.
not, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a realistic impression of that there is a finite number of resources to investigate, and there is a prioritisation matrix through the control strategy that means that there is probably less of a focus at times of greatest need around this complexity on lower level volume crime issues. So the last slide in terms of the overall numbers of those increasing crimes just again sets us against the national picture. Just over 39 forces showed an increase in rape. North Yorkshire Police experienced a 7% increase comparing 15-16 with 16-17, which is slightly lower than England and Wales average. So again, there is a positive wrapped up in there, although I wouldn't want to shout about it too much because of the crime type. But we are slightly lower in terms of experiencing that increase than the national picture. Other sexual offences, 37 forces again showing an increase. We have shown an increase significantly higher than the England and Wales national average at 25%. We have violence with injury, again 38% of forces, 38 forces showing increases. However, in that regard, we are down slightly with 1% against the England and Wales average of an 8% increase. And then violence without injury, 41 out of the 43 forces showing an increase. North Yorkshire up 13% against an England and Wales average of 25%.
So, can I ask about that? It goes back to the point that I raised previously as well. In terms of getting an overall picture and trying to understand it, that given that there are 43 geographically based police forces for England and Wales, there's kind of about half a dozen missing in each of these. Is there any pattern in there of those, the absent ones, that aren't experiencing that stuff? Or they're kind of all randomly distributed? Some it's this. Do you follow? Because if there were a group that you think, well, they're never in this list of the remaining ones that take you up to 43, is there something about them that's worth looking at? I mean, there might not be.
Yeah, I think there is something in that, and I think it's usually around in certain areas, particularly the larger metropolitan areas, that you certainly see certain offending around nighttime economy and urban areas that you won't see in certain force areas. So in those particular crime types, some of the more rural forces will dip out of it. But then in other offences, you will find that it's completely the opposite. I think that's why you'll see it in these areas. But it is worthy of keeping a look at, because like I say, if there's one force that sits outside of all of them, you want to know what's happening there. And we do that benchmarking across the board. Then we take a quick look at satisfaction for those people who are unfortunate enough to have to call us for a service around burglary. The headline statistic there is that pretty much 9 out of 10 burglary victims are satisfied with the service that they receive, and that there are some issues with ensuring that victims are kept informed, which is why we have seen a slight decrease over the last couple of years. We've got some real significant work to understand that ongoing at the moment, and again I'm confident that with a simplified process for the victim contact agreement, we'll have an accurate picture of performance and we'll be able to make sure that we provide the service that we've agreed with the victims on each occasion. So
this tips into the wider work that's going on around customer satisfaction, doesn't it, as well? And it's not just this suggests that it's about timeliness of information. I don't think it is just about timeliness, it's about the quality of information as well. So it's about what information you're given at what point in time. And it's good to see some of the work that is going on elsewhere, looking at some of those communications. Having been on the receiving end of this myself, I sort of have, the quality of those communications were, it wasn't personalised in any shape or form, and I think that's what victims are looking for. They're looking for an update that is specific to them, and it feels as if you are receiving that service, and so this is a major sort of area of development for the force through the work that Kate is doing in the organisation, and that is really welcome as well.
My question was about whether that drop in satisfaction is equally related back to the hubs, or if it's actually a sort of officer level cultural thing. Is it a lack of sort of understanding what a victim wants, or is it just the admin and the updates aren't there quick enough because the team aren't there to do the work? Do you see what I mean? Is it a personal thing, or is it a hub thing?
The detail work that Nexus are ongoing with at the moment hasn't completely concluded. I know that there are some initial findings that come out of it, and in a nutshell, it's extremely complicated. It's a range. Whichever area you look at, there are probably little improvements that can be made that will make the difference here, but we're talking about really small margins. To get 9 out of 10 to being 9.8, 9.9 is going to be incredibly difficult, but it's looking at those little individual areas. Things like when we get the contact agreement, does the contact agreement and the questions we then ask people afterwards, does it correlate? Because if we've asked somebody, do you want contact, and the victim's agreed, I only want contact if there's something to tell me about, and then we conclude the crime because there is no investigative line of inquiry, and then ask them, were you happy with the contact? Sometimes you'll get a negative response, even though we've provided the service that was agreed. And trying to understand that in lining up the service, the contact agreement, and the surveying is very, very difficult.
But that's about the expectations of service, isn't it? So it's about...
And auditing that expectation.
Yeah, which is what we've tried to measure through some of the work that we've done some of the research work that we've done. And I think when we start to think about this in more detail, it is that expectations, because people will always judge a service based on what they expect that service to be. Yeah. And unfairly, it might not always be the service that they would expect from the police service, but it might be a service that they have come to expect generally in terms of customer service. So we've seen, with a different organisation or generally what people's expectations are.
Because this might be the wrong way around to do it, but if 85%-ish of burglaries there's no suspect identified, at what point do we tell the victim that we will try our best and we do X, Y, and Z, but more than likely we might not find anybody. I don't know if they do that or not, and sometimes expectations might be raised sort of where they shouldn't be or couldn't be.
Yeah. And it is different in every occasion, quite rightly should be, depending on what lines of inquiry are there. For example, if you've got some trackable property, you would want to leave the investigation ongoing to give you the best chance of finding that before you resolve it. But we have, part of the learning from this is a more defined and clarified investigation policy for the force. And burglary will fall into that to make sure that we set some parameters for what we expect of investigators and that the victim contact is included in that.
But it's also not just about the investigation itself, isn't it? It's about your dealings with the police service. So how you get your property back, for example, is your experience of how easy it is to get your property back or how quickly you get your property back is part of that as well, isn't it? So it's not just about the investigation and how the investigating officer or the hub or whoever it is contacts you. It's about that general experience of the police service.
Yeah, and it's how you're told as well isn't often so a victim might have agreed to be contacted every fortnight or something, but if the letters aren't written very well or not personalised, it's also how, isn't it? Yeah. Not just the...
I fully expect that when the Nexus work is completed that there'll be an action plan that again we can see delivery of those benefits and we can hopefully measure that over time with improvements in satisfaction, particularly in the area of burglary. I was asked to just try and outline a little bit about what the victim journey looks like. For some this might be new, for others unfortunately maybe like yourself who've maybe experienced this victim journey, it won't be something new, but basically the report of a burglary comes into the force control room. And again, that could be a historic report, it could be something that's happening there and then, but the appropriate assessment is made to determine what response is required based on those circumstances, whether it's an immediate response, a priority or a scheduled attendance. Attendance by a response officer initially, and that initial investigation, and that the victim contact agreement should be agreed there and then, should be scanned onto the occurrence so that whoever picks up that investigation moving forward knows what has been agreed with the victim and what contact they're expecting and by what method. That then would be subject to a further assessment by the regional...
Can I just ask a quick question? The victim contact agreement, I can understand why the force has introduced that, but has anybody actually done a piece of work around whether all that is meaningful to a victim or not? You see what I mean? Because it's useful from a sort of the force's point of view because it sets an expectation from that victim about how they would like to be contacted. But from a victim's point of view, they might not know what they want because they don't know what to expect because this has never happened to them before. You see what I mean? So I wonder if, to a certain extent, you're setting yourself up to fail because actually victim doesn't really understand what it is that they want out of this because they've never experienced it before. Therefore, their expectation, you're setting an expectation that they don't really have any context around. You see what I'm getting at? It's a subtle point. Yeah.
I'm not sure if there was any research prior to my attending at the force.
It comes from the victim code and it's mandatory. So I think you're right that we're measured on it, we're audited on it. We've recently just had another audit on it. Has there been a piece of work nationally to say how effective is the Victims Code, and particularly the Victim Contact Act. I'm not sure whether that has been done, but it is mandatory, and we do think it makes a difference when we start to look at have we contacted victims in the way that we said we would, when it translates then into percentage of satisfaction. But I'm not sure that wider piece of work has ever been done.
I know, and I'm just thinking about what we originally identified through that victim needs assessment, and whether this is, you know, whether this is the right way to deal with it. I'm just sort of thinking again about professional standards, for example. Is that what you end up with then is a sort of a administrative contact process as opposed to a truly victim-centred contact process, if you see what I mean. So in other words, you're working towards...
It's artificial because the person who's ticked I want to be updated at these points doesn't really know what those updates will be. Is that a reasonable time to be expecting something back? If you put the victim at the heart of it, you can make mistakes this way as well, but you sort of do them as and when they're necessary and required, having understood what the victim wants in a more rounded way.
I mean, if you look at the Victim Contact Agreement, it is an administrative process, and I think there is a balance to be met between not having a process and having it so open that you've no idea what's happening, and you've got no expectation.
I just wonder whether it's a sort of a race to the bottom in a way. In other words, you just set out a sort of minimum standard and everybody thinks that that's what it is that you should be meeting, when actually there might be other needs that the victim might have that are not necessarily being taken into consideration because you've got it in the administration that this is how it's going to happen, if you see what I mean.
I think the point is what gets measured gets done. We have done an awful lot of work with the workforce around victim contact, and actually it is translating into a high satisfaction rate, particularly for burglary, but there is always more that we can do around victims.
And I think some of those small margins are the document, and therefore the process, is largely down to the individual that's doing it and how they do that with the victim, because it does allow you a great deal of scope to meet different expectations. The reason it is in the form...
They don't have expectations. This is what the research that we did showed very clearly, was that they don't know what to expect. So you're asking them to make to frame a response based on an expectation that they don't have, because it's not, they don't know what to expect, so they don't know. So for example, when we did the research on the contact on the control room, people said in the research that they did that they thought 5 minutes was you know, for a response on the 101 number would be okay. Well, we know that in reality they don't think 5 minutes is okay. You see what I mean? Because that 5 minutes, they don't know what the expectation actually is when they're in this reality of that situation. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at. And it's trying to be victim-centred as opposed to process-led. Yeah. And that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to get to.
Maybe this is something that we should feed back to Kate as well, and for her way, because obviously the victim booklet is also being redone at the moment, and potentially there's something that could be included in that, and I can feed that back to Wendy as well. I think from the anecdotal evidence that we get into the office, the complaints that arise from the victim contact agreement specifically are more around, you know, I said I only want to be updated when something happened, but I didn't hear anything for 2 weeks. So what's going on there? There's an understanding there, obviously a lack of understanding there, that nothing might happen for a month, and then you'll get an update. But, you know, so I think we could potentially include language around that. I think the other thing, though, is we've had several people write in about when something has changed, or they have found something, extra piece of evidence or something, and it might be that something's gone cold for a little while, but then they've been looking on an auction site, for example, and found their item being sold, that then they report that in, and there is no there is no room to change the contact agreement necessarily. They're finding that it's difficult to change the contact agreement and change the level of contact that they are given. And there have been a number of complaints actually through PSD, which then obviously don't necessarily get resolved very well, about changing the contact agreement and the level of contact. So I think there's probably a piece of work to look at there about flexibility in increasing contact if that's required.
Or decreasing it.
Yeah.
I think the issue here is around a proportionate. At the end of the day, we are being held to account for the delivery of the victims' code, which is not set by us. So we need to have one eye on that, but at the same time, we need to be flexible enough to provide the officers and staff with educated trigger points, so they can revisit whatever that agreement is. Because if you're having a conversation with somebody who's never had any experience whatsoever of the police service, they might have either unrealistic expectations or realistic expectations. How do you have that conversation with somebody who's not had that experience? We then need to try and help the officers and staff to explain this is the norm about how an investigation will go. And probably at the time, and you can never say never, but you probably know that the chances of you actually finding somebody for this within the next period of time is highly, no witnesses, time of day, all those sorts of things. But I think the clash, so to some degree, is that if somebody sat down in a room and said, I don't want any contact for 2 weeks, the police officers will take that as that's what's been agreed, and then don't understand when people come back in 10 days' time and said, you haven't contacted me. Well, that was the agreement. So it's how do you give officers the information to help the public and the victims have a more mature view of what they may or may not be getting from the public, from the police.
And that's why, that's why I think the Victims Code sets out the minimum. And so I would hope that we're not just working to the Victims Code, that we are actually thinking about how we can genuinely provide a victim-centred service, because that Victims Code goes some way to doing this. But if you look at the victim needs assessment that we did right back in whatever it was, there's a lot more to it than is set out in that Victims Code. And presumably this is part of the work that Kate is doing, isn't it? And looking at this in a more rounded way. Because if we're just ticking the boxes of the Victims Code, you then wonder whether or not that is really leading to a victim-centred approach.
And if the feedback is that we need to build in greater flexibility, and there's a simple way of doing that, then obviously that's something that we'd want to work into the process. If someone wants to change that, I didn't want to be told anything now, but now I'd like a weekly update, well, we should be able to flex to that, shouldn't we? I think we then got to the assessment from the regional control room, which determines what crime scene investigator responds. And again, that's a bespoke response based on some advice to the victim prior to attendance and then appropriate attendance. The service level agreement is a 100% target for what were old dwelling burglary offences, and as a subcategory within the new residential, they still keep 100% as a service level agreement. You then have follow-up visits, crime prevention and neighbourhood policing teams throughout that period of time as the initial investigation is underway. And then depending on the investigative outcome, there'll be an allocation to a DC or an appropriate member of staff within the investigation hub. And if evidential lines of inquiry exist, a prosecution and potentially include a victim impact statement prior to the prosecution concluding. And then I think the final slide just gives you an outline there of the current state of play with for North Yorkshire within the regional crime scene investigation service. The service level agreement is to attend all reported burglary dwellings, a target of 85%, and that looking at 1st of April 17 up to the end of July, 94 out of 95 reported incidents equates to a 98.9% achievement, which is above the target. Attending within 6 hours of being notified, again, it's an 85% target, and for North Yorkshire we achieved 84 out of 95 reported incidents and 88.4%. and then to process fingerprints, DNA and footwear recovered within 12 hours, 95% target, and they actually achieved 100%. And one of the things that's driving some of those improvements is that we're really lucky in terms of the region, because through different funding streams and developments and projects that are underway at the Regional Scientific Support Unit, we've now got direct submission from scene of fingerprints through a digital pathway straight away onto the database for it to be assessed, and within an hour or so you're going to get those hits coming back to identify suspects that again get fast-tracked into the forces for us to take action and get an early arrest in. And again, the DNA process is being streamlined again so that you've got really fast turnaround and custody areas for suspects and for crime scene stains, which again will transform how quickly we can get arrests in place and the evidence that comes from that, which I think is a real positive, because North Yorkshire are benefiting from that already.
I've asked this already, Steve, but just to clarify in this context, is there an SLA for attempted burglary attendance, or is that more on a case-by-case basis?
It's included within burglary dwelling. It doesn't matter whether it's an attempt or a full offence, the same service level agreement, so they're included in there.
Great, thank you.
I was just going to give the reassurance around that, Commissioner, around the police-to-police collaboration that we talk about and what we get from the region. These data sets are scrutinised at ACC board. That we hold once a month, so we've got a programme of work that comes to us, and we do look at these, and I know that Steve gets those data sets as well, and we have conversations to make sure that we are asking the appropriate questions, but I'm really satisfied at the moment with the service that we're getting.
It's a good service. I did go down and visit them recently, actually, and one of the things that came out of that was that some of the innovative stuff that they are trialling isn't necessarily being done here in North Yorkshire, and that it's in other parts of the regional setup. I suppose the question is how that's going to be rolled out and when we start to see the full benefit of all of that. And that's not for you, Steve, but I think that's something we probably need to just sort of follow up through other channels. Okay. All right.
That's the end of the presentation, unless there's any other further questions.
Have got anybody else? I'm just wondering whether or not it might be helpful maybe in 6 months' time just to touch base on this again, given that there have been some issues, that a plan is in place to address them, and to look at particularly around the discussion that we had earlier, perhaps around the local plans and the local impact and the local priorities, because burglary is included in those local priorities.
I think we need to find, in fact, with this serious organised crime thematic that Steve brought last time, we'd had a similar thing, because there's lots of improvements in that field too. I think we need to find a way via this meeting to not necessarily bring things back here, but get those updates in when some of these benefits might be felt in investigation hubs or serious whatever it is.
If you're happy with the theme, I can provide an update, an agreed point by way of a paper. And if you deem you want me to come back, I'll come back.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about from a transparency point of view, how we just make sure that these things are captured and the public is kept up to date. So maybe a paper in a few months' time would be a good thing, and then we could publish that on the back of this meeting and this theme, if you see what I mean.
And
so
we don't necessarily have to go through it. It can just be published for sort of the public's benefit.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so Amanda, I think we're over are we over to you now for item 5? Yeah.
What I intend to do, Commissioner, is summarise where possible on the basis that we have covered off some of this information already, and then when we get to slide, I understand there's been a separate presentation sent across that will go into that in more detail. Helpfully, Steve did touch on some of these increases in crime. You will know that our position has been for some time now that we're seeing a slight increase in crime, which at the moment stands at 5.1% for total crime. However, the context of that is that North Yorkshire Police remains the lowest crime area within England. and we've had that position for some time now. There are some long-standing crime trends. Again, Steve helpfully touched upon those. I don't intend to go into them in much more detail, to be honest, which is around the sexual offences, particularly rape, and the violence without injury. Just quite recently, we've seen some increases both in criminal damage and shoplifting. You would be reassured to know that there's local policing plans in place to tackle those issues.
Can I ask Amanda, it's partly something, it was in Steve's presentation actually, but links to what you just said. Sometimes you want to see reporting going up in various crimes because that signifies confidence. And one of the ones Steve had on his particular presentation, rape had gone up in North Yorkshire, but not as much as other places. Are we happy that we're recording as much as as much as we're confident we can get victims to bring to us? Because in others we're ahead, so in sexual offences we had a higher increase than most other areas, but in rape we were lower.
Yeah, I think victim confidence is increasing all the time. I think we're dealing with two issues. One is the unfortunate circumstances of a rape happening this week that then gets reported, but also the non-recent abuse cases that we are still dealing with that are, of course, rather sadly linked to rape as well. So we're dealing with both of those issues. So the trends, therefore, are a little bit more difficult to track, but we're doing everything that we can in order to encourage people to come forward. Linked to ongoing performance, we still have that long-term downward trend in relation to kills, seriously injured casualties, and of course we had a thematic quite recently in relation to our road safety. Call handling performance continues to be an exception, and I have a separate presentation in order to deal with that. The other headline figure for me, alongside the fact that we do remain the safest place in England, is that our satisfaction remains high. 8 out of 10 victims are satisfied with our service, and that's really, really good news for us. Okay, I don't intend to dwell on this page much more than that. There's some statistics here that members of the public may want to look at in a little bit more detail. We had high levels of shop theft here in York in July and August, and then we've had some small increases across each of the districts in relation to criminal damage. They've mainly been where unknown offenders have caused damage before making off, and they've either been unseen or unheard, and they have only been small increases. Our long-term trends are shown again on this slide in relation to both rape, sexual offences, and then the violence without injury. The next slide just gives a summary of where we are in relation to antisocial behaviour. We're in line with last year, and there is still that long-term trend upwards in relation to offences that we call public safety and welfare. That's a national category that's being set. And that's really about the safeguarding of vulnerable people. Commissioner, we have a number of pages that I don't intend to go into in too much detail next, which just list some of the operations that we're dealing with. It's important to note that these are about property crime, which is theft and damage. We've got a number of operations linked to these crime categories. In particular, we continue with Operation Hawk, which is one of our operations linked to rural crime. We also have Operation Checkpoint, and I know the Deputy Commissioner came out onto an Operation Checkpoint quite recently. That continues to be really successful. That is about mobilising our neighbouring forces alongside North Yorkshire Police, but importantly, it's made so successful because the volunteers that continue to give up their time night after night to assist with policing. We've got a number of other operations that are linked to nighttime economy in places where they need it most, such as Scarborough, which is Operation Ambience, and of course here in York too. There's a summary within the pack in relation to our rural task force that continues to go from strength to strength. We're currently looking now at taking new special constables and also increasing our volunteers. Our proactivity continues, as does our problem solving. We're linked into some national operations now because of the work that the Chief Constable and I are doing around the national portfolio. Of note is Operation Galileo, but there are other examples within the pack as well.
So, Amanda, No, go on. So I know this is one of the grey areas, but I'll mention it anyway. One of the other really significant issues for people in rural areas is fly tipping, and this isn't mentioned anywhere in any of this. And I know that that is a partnership approach between the local authority and the police as to how we deal with that. But I think at some point we do need to think about fly tipping. There's been some good work in places like Selby and places like that, but I think that is something that possibly we need to just have a look at some point.
Commissioner, it's interesting that you raised that, because I've had a conversation with Tom over the lunch break about we're actually reporting here on theft and damage, property crime, and of course there's much more to our performance than just that. Yeah. And I think over time, I think this pack should and will get more sophisticated in relation to what we report on. In relation to fly tipping, however, because of the national work that we're doing, we are looking at a new national strategy for rural crime that, of course, will be centred here in North Yorkshire alongside the rest of the country. Fly tipping is an issue. It's coming up both in the National Rural Crime Network survey and in all of the work that we do as well. Certainly deserves a problem-solving approach, because it isn't purely a policing issue.
So can I just, perhaps can we take that, Amanda, through the NRCN, through the National Rural Crime Work, because I think members of that, both operational members, but also the other wider membership, it's the issue that is raised time and time again as something that the network is concerned about. And if through your national work you're looking at that issue, I think that will be a good forum to take that through, if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, and forgive me, I can't remember all 5 of them, I should be able to, but it's a 5+1. The +1 is actually fly tipping, because actually the concern of the service is that obviously we're part of the problem solving of it, but it's not our statutory responsibility. So because we're so keen to maintain the confidence of our rural community, we want to get involved in how we get to some solutions around it, but there's a danger of us taking responsibility for something that actually is the responsibility of other people too.
No, I understand that, and there is supposed to have been some work done in Parliament on this issue as well, and we've been long awaiting a report there. So it is I'm not suggesting that the police force just takes this on, but I think it's how, from a local and a national point of view, the response to the public on the part of all the people who are involved in this can improve, because it is, a significant issue, not helped by the fact, of course, that the charging regime has changed around it, which has caused, arguably, well, we've seen an increase in it since charges were introduced. So there are other issues at play here, but it has a big impact.
Yeah, and again, we're in danger of being violently in agreement with each other. I think that the work and the feedback, both that we did and held them here with the workshops for the internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders, the work with the NFU is the topic.
Yeah, it is.
And I suppose we're trying to make sure we work with all those stakeholders to get it higher up the agenda. And I mean, again, the interesting debate is that they are not recordable crimes.
No.
And I'm not sure how much my colleagues would want that added to their statistics.
Can I ask Amanda about the rural volunteer patrol? What that is, and for example, does it have a part to play in identifying flag tipping potentially, or other things, I suppose?
What we've tried to do is professionalise, if you like, and bring about some consistency of the way that we manage our volunteers who want to come out and patrol. So that's exactly what that is. You'd have experienced that on the evening in Checkpoint. So
it's, rather than being volunteers in the informal sense, they're police volunteers who sort of go through a process. I see.
Yeah, and some of that is about making sure that we're then in a position to kind of share intelligence and information and access to resource, and just to professionalise that kind of approach, really. Some of this is, as you know, linked to the way in which the volunteers in Selby were being deployed, for example. And we just need to make some consistency across the organisation.
Okay. Just moving on to the next slide, which is headed up as Operation Hawk. I think what I wanted to pull out of this is Of course, our units, such as road policing groups, such as firearms support unit and dogs, have their primary roles, but actually we maximise the opportunity that those assets afford us and deploy into Operation Hawk, particularly around the rural areas whenever we can. And then I'll just draw your attention to the bullet point just above Operation Checkpoint, which I touched upon earlier, which is our roads policing group responded after an ANPR activation looking for a red Mini being a stolen vehicle from a 2-in-1 burglary in Whitby in one of our rural areas. The 2 occupants of the vehicle were arrested and the driver was also arrested for being disqualified. So that's just one of the many successes that we're currently having in relation to deploying our ANPR assets alongside our people.
I think ANPR is a success story for North Yorkshire, actually, and I do wonder, the discussion that we were having earlier on around tracking the progress of investments, I think that's perhaps one of the things that we should have a look at, because I certainly remember when I first came into this role back in 2012, the state of our ANPR was not where it needed to be, and there's been significant improvements over that, and I think, you know, we should have a look at that and see how it's working.
We have within the pack some of the notable investigations. Of course, Operation Essence linked to Claudia Lawrence continues, as do a number of other high-profile cases that are either in the process of still being investigated, or they're either at or due at court very shortly. That is indicative of the success that we've had with the collaboration with Cleveland Police in relation to the 2 major crime units. 2 weeks ago now, we brought both the teams together for a continuous professional development day. It was really successful, actually. They had some good inputs from counter-terrorism, from other senior investigating officers from around the country, and the feedback was excellent in relation to that. That takes us on to our maps, which just flag up at a local level where crime has changed. We must remember that these levels are actually low, so when it comes to percentages, the changes are not that significant. But just to reassure you again that we do have problem-solving plans in place in relation to where the increases are taking place. In particular, focus for us at the moment is Selby, Harrogate and Richmondshire. Okay,
so I've had, obviously, as you would expect, some feedback from the public around some of these. They are feeling the impact of some of this in local communities, particularly in the Selby area. And I think what would be really helpful is to have, when we're going out and engaging with the public, we get quite a lot of feedback that the PCSOs and people like that are not engaging with parish councils and community groups. There's been changes in staffing that has resulted in people sort of feeling as if they've lost their contact with local officers, PCSOs in particular. And I just wonder whether we do need a little bit more detail to be able to provide reassurance to the public on some of these things, and we can take that outside of this meeting.
And just the Selby numbers are quite high. I know, for example, in Craven, numbers are really low, and then percentages will change a lot. But Selby, it does seem more of an issue, actually. So I don't know what's driving that. There isn't any context on that slide. But
yeah, but we've certainly had feedback from people from surgeries in Selby that there's concerns, and certainly I think they do. That there have, in some areas, there have been some key changes in people, and obviously when there are, and you know that happens, but sometimes the handover, if you like, isn't perhaps as planned as it could be. Sometimes because circumstances dictate it can't be, but people feel they lose that connection, and they see things, particular things going on, and they start to sort of respond. And I do think there's some reassurance that is needed in the Selby area at the minute, in particular.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of kind of providing that reassurance around what's actually specifically happening in Selby, but the more systemic nature of how we deal with stuff will be picked up in the local policing community public accountability meeting that we talked about previously. Yeah,
and one of the things that we're planning to do, I mean, Tom's gone now, but I've spoken to DCC Winwood about this, is going to do a review from our perspective, a questionnaire survey of how people in particular feel as if they feel their services from PCSOs at the moment. We're busy constructing a questionnaire around that, and we've had conversations with DCC Winwood about it, and she's inputting into that. So I think that could be quite an interesting piece of work to make sure that we get that right as well. And in York in particular, because obviously there have been changes to the model in York, and it seemed like quite a good point since we're sort of into the implementation period now. It's had a chance to bed in to actually have a look at that.
Okay, similar slide then in relation to antisocial behaviour with the year-on-year differences. Some things to flag up there. You can see there's been some increases, for instance, in Harrogate, and we've got operations that are planned in relation to Valley Gardens in Harrogate. That's multi-agency. We've got Liberate operating in York alongside Operation Confiscate, and they're targeted on some of our hotspot areas.
Okay, so that's good as well, because we have had some complaints come into the OPCC about the Valley Gardens in particular, so that's good. Thank you.
And about the mopeds in York, so yeah, that's good too.
Yeah.
Okay, the next slide is in relation to force control room. I intended to touch on that separately, if that was okay. And that takes me to the end of this presentation. I'm hoping that the force control room one is loaded up next.
Okay, great. Anybody got any more questions on that? No. Okay.
We're happy to move on to the force control room.
Yeah, there's the people element of that pack, Amanda.
Yeah. I've got it on back to front on mine. Just
sorry.
No. The way my pack's put together. I think the things that I wanted to pull out of the people element are this really. You can see that for September 17 for police officer projected numbers were at 1,322 with the long-term FTE target of 1,400. To reassure you, Commissioner, the next intake of 28 student officers, really good news, is scheduled for October 2017, with a further intake of 28 transferees scheduled for January 2018. And Steve touched on that earlier about targeting specific skills such as investigators.
So picking up on the conversation that we had this morning, those transferees, we do know how much they're going to cost, don't we?
Not just exactly at the moment. No.
Right, okay.
We don't know exactly who they're going to be and when.
Right, so can we just pick up on the sort of conversation we had this morning around lessons learnt there and making sure that we do get that accurate information? Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to add as well, and there is an intake of students planned again in March 18. Which is what will take us to 1379 by the end of March.
Okay, in relation to PCSOs, we currently stand at 198 against a target of 200, which is really good news. And then moving on to our police staff. In particular, we've got an intake of 17 force control room staff planned for October and a further intake of 20 in January, which I'm sure will assist us when we move on to the next slide shortly. And then the other good news for me is in relation to our special constables. We've got 14 special constables due to commence on the 23rd of September, which was last week. And in fact, someone from my office started their training just on Saturday, with a further intake of 14 due in November 2017. In relation to force control, and then Commissioner, I've got a separate presentation that we've managed to pull together. I think the headlines of this has been an increase in 999s.
Amanda, can I just want to start by just saying thank you to all the staff in the control room, because I've been down there on a couple of occasions recently, and obviously there are issues in there, but you know, the individuals in that control room do a fantastic job and they're working really hard, and it has been challenging for them. So I just want to say publicly thank you to those staff.
Thank you. Okay, so some context then. I'm going to start with 999 performance and move on to 101. You'll be aware from the recent reporting that we've been doing that we've had an increase in 999 demand. That's felt not just locally but nationally actually, and that demand is compared to previous years. That undoubtedly directly impacts on how long it takes us to answer the phone. There's no other way around that. We've also looked at the impact that then has on our attendance. I'm pleased to say that our attendance at incidents has remained strong during that time. So it's actually the issue of answering the phone rather than dispatching officers that we're most concerned with within the force control room. I'm not doing very well with this flicker in my glasses, actually. Just hang on a second. Okay. In relation to 101 performance, then, that's anything other than a 999 call.
So, sorry, just Amanda, can I just, because there was some reporting on Radio York around 999 performance that wasn't quite right, and I think it might be a good opportunity to set the
well, we weren't totally sure.
Straight.
Amanda, you might be able to sort of assist. I think there was confusion with. I think there was a confusion with FOIs about secondary lines. So 999 calls have a slightly unusual way of routing themselves because to make sure there aren't systematic problems with phone lines rather than a busy control room, BT send calls through different lines into the control room to make sure one isn't broken. And I think there's been some coverage of the use of secondary lines, where it's actually relatively normal. It does mean there's been a slight delay in picking it up, but it's relatively normal, and every police force has got multiple lines for 999. And I think that was confused with abandoned calls, potentially. So I don't know if we've got figures for the physical abandonment of 999 calls, which I understand are really low, and effectively none will get abandoned unless they just aren't picked up, and given most are picked up in 10 seconds, that shouldn't be very many. So I don't know if in the pack there is an abandoned, or in your background paper there's anything about the actual numbers of abandoned calls for 999.
The statistics that were being quoted on Radio York were we think were incorrect and actually were quite misleading.
Unfortunately, Commissioner, I'm not cited on exactly what went out in Radio York, so in order to do it factually, I would need to go away and just have a look at that. But I can reassure you that a secondary line is not where a call's been abandoned, somebody's rang in and...
We know that.
We still don't know, I still don't know exactly what Radio York got, and they may have done other work that just wasn't given to me, so there's still confusion. I will just might be worth the police force clarifying the number of 999 calls that are abandoned, because from speaking to the control room manager, it's lower than what the public coverage was.
My understanding is that it's incredibly rare that a 999 call is abandoned. It's just routed in a different way than other calls, so we can provide that clarity.
Yeah, I think just for a point of record we should do. Yeah.
Okay, if I move on then to 101 performance, this is where a caller dials the national number, which is 101, and they select option 1, which is known as an inquiry call. So again, we've had an increase in these.
Can I just for the public, that means the calls to the sort of control room people, because options 2 and 3 are sort of automatic type thing. So this is what most people would imagine in their heads as a 101 call, just to clarify.
Absolutely. So what we do find is if somebody rings 101 and we're not as quick to answer the phone, they will on occasions ring us on 999, so that's sometimes why you see that increase. So the two things are directly related, but we would always put priority on somebody ringing us on the 999 line.
I think this is an opportunity to make it clear that if there is a delay on 101, dialing 999 for a non-emergency is really something that shouldn't happen. We have had some examples recently where the control room have there was a whole range of different examples when, for example, there was mud on the road and they couldn't get through on the 101 and they dialed 999, and the controllers in the control room will quite rightly tell people off if they're calling on a 999 line for a non-emergency, and people need to expect that if they do that.
I don't even think mud on the road's a policing issue, is it? It's a council issue, isn't it?
It's a high-risk agency issue. I suppose, just to reinforce that, the 999 system was there for an emergency purpose. I fully appreciate the frustration people have if we're taking too long to answer the 101, but the answer isn't to ring 999. And I think that some of the things that Amanda will go through will hopefully alleviate that in due course. But yeah, there are examples that we can give in due course around some of the misuse of the 999 system.
Yeah. Generally, demand peaks in August, both for us and actually nationally as well. Demand appears to have dropped for us this August, but we think it's due to the way that we've changed our systems to try and improve performance. So that hold for an operator line has diverted demand away from the main lines. Our average speed of answer had increased to above 200 seconds in June, peaking in July at 250. And the abandonment rate did increase to 23% in that same period. August performance shows improvements on July. We can't be absolutely certain, but this is highly likely to be a result of the operator line. And at the time of writing, the September performance was at 132 seconds and 22% abandonment rate. We think that's being impacted by other things that we've introduced, which I've got some details of in the pack, which is in relation to our queue buster and our crime and occurrence management. So I think the message here is we fully realise that we need to improve in this area, and we've put measures in place which, whilst it's early days, it seems to be showing that it's improving for us.
I think, Amanda, one of the things that people, and obviously we've had a huge amount of feedback on this issue, is that people think that there must be a way to deal with this quickly, and that it's an easy fix, and it really isn't. And I think that the force needs to demonstrate over time what you're doing to fix this, because I think it is complicated, and there's lots of reasons why it's happening, and it is going to take time to fix. And I do think that there needs to be a more coherent communications programme with the public around what the force is doing to solve these problems, rather than just a sort of the odd press release every now and again. And I think we need to work quite closely with colleagues in communication, in comms, about how this is done to reassure the public that this problem is being solved.
And I think that's a danger, isn't it, of quite rightly, Commissioner, you holding us to account for performance in this area, but it's a really complex area of business, so reporting on a monthly basis just captures a moment in time. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's complex. The measures and improvements that we've put in place will take some time. I think, though, the green shoots of improvement are hopefully there, and some of the things that we've put in place over the summer are starting to show a slight difference.
And certainly when you go into the control room, people are feeling that. They are feeling that they can see light at the end of the tunnel. And I think for the people in the control room, that is really important, that they can see that things are starting to happen and things are improving.
Sorry, I agree. I think one of the things we've got to try and get across, and I would point people to the recruitment campaign we did for new operators within the Force Control Room that's on YouTube. I think people have this belief that we've got people sat there like the old-fashioned switchboard, where they literally answer the phone, write down something, and then pass it on to somebody else. It's actually quite a professional role now that actually triages quite complex and difficult calls from the public in a way that then allows us to deploy the most effective resource. And that is why the training for the staff actually takes that long. And I don't think we've been able to get that message out to people, that the level of professionalism this is not as simple as just answering the phone. This is about doing the assessment through the Thrive process and making sure we deploy the right resources to the need. And actually, one of the pressures that we've put on ourselves is the fact that our call taking time is longer now, because we're spending more time talking to the public to understand their needs. That's having a knock-on impact. And I think the other thing is, I agree around the press releases, but some of those are reactive to some ill-informed comment that's been made around some of these issues, but also the fact that there are a series of measures that have now been put into place to hopefully start to mitigate. I think there's a conversation we need to have around what does that look like in the future, because I think there is potential other areas that we could invest in, and what is the level of service we're seeking to achieve. Because if my memory of the Buzz review, I know you mentioned 5 minutes before, but I think some of it was around after a minute, 10 seconds, people start getting agitated around not having their call answered. So it's just understand what is the industry standard that we're trying to get to here, and then we can satisfy and manage expectations. And nobody's suggesting for a moment it's anywhere near fixed yet.
I do also think, though, that one of the things that is working quite well is the callback. And I think, you know, if people are experiencing a delay and the Queue Buster system kicks in and offers a callback, that people should feel confident in that service because it is good. And I think that perhaps, again, so talking about communications, perhaps there's something more that we can do around this rather than just, as I say, just sticking out a press release. I think there's some nuances to this that really are quite good, and we're not perhaps getting that across in the way that we should be.
Okay, the next slide is about the incident management. I touched on this earlier. I won't dwell on this, but we do still look at how do we respond once the call comes in. I'm pleased to say that we continue to do well in this area, both in relation to our urban areas and our rural areas. I think the interesting thing for me on here is we talked earlier on about public safety and welfare. 34% of all of our calls are linked to that, rather than being linked to crime, which is about 17%. So it just shows the where the bulk of our work is once those calls come in.
It's more than crime and ASB put together.
Yeah. Yeah, and really complex needs generally of the individuals involved.
Also, it's worth pointing out that the admin percentage there is something that you're significantly trying to reduce through other things as well, because that is admin calls that shouldn't really be going to a frontline resource.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The people that have answered the phone in the past have been really highly specialised. What we're trying to do is to bring in a different level of service for some people who want to be passed on to somebody else. The next slide is an example of inappropriate calls into 101. I think it's important to say that we do take action when we need to. It does impact on our ability to answer the call to those in greatest need dialing 999, and my plea to the public is just think before you pick up the telephone. We are trying to educate the public both as they ring into the control room and then through avenues such as today, and also out in the media. Issues such as this to have an increase in demand on us, and just last night we got a call in asking I don't understand how to do my maths homework. That might be a crisis in my house on occasions, but not one that we would ring 101 for. Really, really inappropriate and taking up lots of time when we need to focus on members of the public who need it. DCC Windward chairs a goal group in relation to this, such as the importance that we've put on this area of business. These are just some actions that DCC Windward has taken as a result of that goal group. So following feedback from the public, we've introduced that hold for an operator. Sometimes people want to speak to somebody when they ring up, and that options that we had in the past weren't quite working for us. Almost 8,000 calls are now answered on the operator line in August. That's about 260 calls a day. And actually for September, we're averaging about 280 calls a day. That's really, really good news. There's some analysis there about the call type. 35% of our calls are resulting in an incident being recorded. 32% of calls are for another department or an individual. 33% of calls are quick queries dealt with by an operator. So not everything is people who are in dire need of our services, and it's the way that we start to tackle those as those calls come in. That the above is based on average demand across the week. On a weekend, 42% of calls are quick queries. I would suggest that that changes because we've got high demand for policing services on a weekend and probably less enquiries for other departments. We're providing callers with a service when they're unsure who it is they need to speak with, and as a result there's been a reduction in the abandonment rate at the automated switchboard from 64 calls to 34 calls per day, so it would suggest that that is actually working for us. In context, there's still over 500 calls per day to option 2, which is the automatic switchboard, option 3, which is custody, and option 4, which is lost and found property. More measures then being taken by the goal group. We've introduced Queue Buster, and I know you've just alluded to that, Commissioner. That's a facility where the caller can elect to take a call back. It went live on the 30th of August, and in the period to the 24th of September, on average 139 people per day using this service. On average, a caller receives a call back within 8 minutes, and the anecdotal feedback from callers so far is very positive, albeit we have said that these measures that we've put in place will take a longer period of time to start and measure.
I think that 8 minutes has dropped as well, because when I was down there, it was about 5 minutes. So, yeah.
I think that's the average, and because it's gone live only quite recently, it will fluctuate over time. The other key thing I think is that 50 staff have been recruited since August 2016 in order to fill vacancies. Of this, 38 are fully trained and accredited, with 12 dispatchers still in training. Going forward, we're recruiting a further 13 comms and 4 dispatch operatives in October 17, and a further 9 comms and 11 dispatch operatives in January 2018. We should know, however, and we talked about that medium-term plan, training requires abstraction of existing skills staff to run the courses and to do the tutorship, but we've changed how we do that. It's previously been delivered on a one-to-one basis. What we're now trying to do is a tutor unit where all new trainees are being tutored in a separate room, in a group, which will have less impact on the abstraction rate of fully skilled staff. The other thing that we've looked at is what were the other tasks that we were asking our control room staff to perform, and one of those was around crime recording and occurrence management. We did a review in 2016, and that recommended that that function was removed from the FCR and that there was another unit that merged with that. There was a 3-month pilot that began on the 5th of September. The purpose of this pilot is to improve call handling performance by removing the crime and occurrence administration function. Initial indications are positive in the 2 weeks since go live compared to the average levels in June to August. So we've had a reduced abandonment rate on in the inquiry line from 30% to 20%, which is fantastic, and a reduction in the average speed of answer from 230 seconds to 121 seconds. The only rider that we would put on this, Commissioner, is it's too early to make any sound evidence-based conclusions yet. Hence, we've called it a pilot, and we're going to do a full review early in 2018.
Yeah, and that has resulted in some resources being moved from the control room, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
So we've got to look at the impact of that, obviously.
And it's about getting those levels right, but what we were finding was because we were multi-skilling the operatives within there, they weren't then focusing in on what they were really trained to do.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that was something the Buzz recommended in 2015, but I could be wrong, but it might be worth just when that first crops up.
I'm not sure about the Buzz, but it was definitely one of the recommendations from the PSNI review.
Just some national context there then. There's no national data set readily available. However, based on the sample of forces that responded to a survey, we can say that forces are seeing a rise in demand nationally. Within that context then, North Yorkshire Police's abandonment rate over the last 3 months is not an outlier. North Yorkshire Police's average speed of answer in the last 3 months, again, is not an outlier. Please don't misinterpret that. That's not us saying that we don't have a problem. It's just saying that within the national context, we're not sitting as an outlier.
Yeah, I think that context is important because people will judge the force by the experience that they have when they ring you, not what is going on in other parts of the country.
Absolutely. Nationally, there's been a general increase in demand across all the emergency services, and national opinion around the increase in 999 calls is that people are struggling to get through on 101 and are then ringing 999. Some of the measures described above, along with the operator function, should start to ease this. Commissioner, that concludes the presentation in relation to the force control.
That's very good because we've just about concluded the timing that we've got. So well done, Amanda. Just to say that this item, the control room item, will be brought back on a monthly basis until we start to see some significant on-the-ground improvement in this service. But there is a lot going on and progress is being made. So thank you to all involved. So the sort of final item is the forward planner. Will, I think we've got further discussions around that for post-January as well, which we're on with, aren't we?
That's right, so we can start filling in again. Sorry, yeah, Julie, you're right. I think we can start filling in the plan from February onwards now with a few more thematics.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Simon, have we had any questions?
No, we actually have a last one check. No.
No. Okay, thank you. Has anybody got anything else they'd like to raise? Nope. Thank you very much.